Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I specialize in educational poker vlogs. I've been a professional poker player for a very long time, so if you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, you've come to the right place. Without wasting any more of your precious time, let's jump right into the action. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where we're buying for $1,500, which is 300 big blinds. It's Friday morning on January 17th. We start at 12:43, right after midnight. 20 minutes into the session, we're at a short 5-handed table. Under the gun opens for 15. I look down at 10 jack offsuit. Normally, I would just fold this garbage. I don't even bother limping with it. But since we're pretty short-handed right now, I open up my range a lot wider, especially when I have position to the original raiser. So here I call in the cutoff, and the button tags along as well. We go 3 ways to a flop of Jack, 4, 2, with 2 hearts. Not bad. We flop top pair in a short-handed game. That's usually pretty decent. I mentioned the fact that the game is short-handed because people will open raise with a much wider range, just like how I'm calling with a wider than normal range. So when under the gun C bets for 25, I make the easy call. Suddenly, the button comes in for a raise, but it's a really weird one. He min raises to 50 with a $500 stack. This is a very non-standard play, especially on such a wet, dynamic board. Ace-3 or Ace-5 both have gut shots with an overcard, and there's also a very obvious flush draw as well. I think a more realistic raise with a big hand here should be closer to like 100 or even 125. So for this tiny min raise, we both make the call, bloating the pot up to $200. The turn comes, and it's a 4 of spades, pairing middle pair. This decreases the likelihood the button flopped a set, but it's still a very real possibility if he has a hand like pocket 2s. Under the gun and I both check. The button throws out another very timid bet of 75. This is enough to get under the gun to fold. Okay, so at this point, I think the button either has a full house or complete air. If he were a tricky player like me, you guys know I love to give people an incredibly cheap price for their dead draws. However, I would never min raise this wet flop, so I can only assume he's not a standard player. I have top pair, but my kicker kind of blows. I'm never calling hoping to hit a 3-outer though, in case my opponent has a bigger jack, or a 4-outer if he has pocket 2s. I know it's only $75, and that may seem small for a 2-5 game, but we still have to be logical here. I'm only ever calling here if I think I'm good. If you ever make this type of call on the turn, so long as the board doesn't change, you need to be fully prepared to call a pot-sized bet on the river. It doesn't make sense to burn $75 just on hopes and dreams of improving with a 2 or 3-outer. So I do end up making the call, fully expecting not to improve. Meanwhile, clenching my butt cheeks, getting ready for some river pain. So the river comes, and wouldn't you know it, it's a king of clubs, not doing a whole lot for us, other than helping us chop against exactly Jack Queen. So I check for a third time, fully prepared to call another bet with my now reduced hand of second pair. And that bet does come, but it's for a laughable $65, which is weaker than his turn bet. If you're bluffing me here, my brother, you're trying to whack me with a wet noodle. But if you have a hand like quads, you could have gotten me to pay a much higher price. So I make the call, and my opponent flips over Ace-8 of hearts for the missed nut flush draw. We table our hand, and it's good to win this nice-sized pot to start the night. Okay, so time for some strategy talk. You may have heard you're supposed to play your draws in position aggressively to maximize fold equity. This is true, but don't mimic what my opponent did. It was kind of half-arsed and ended up costing him more than if he just called normally. So how I would have played this hand is raised on the flop to about 75 or 85. If you bink the nut flush on the turn, slow down and use like a half pot size for value. Against a $75 raise, I may or may not call there with my jack and weak kicker. He could have possibly taken the pot down right then and there. Now, let's assume I do call and under the gun folds, since I think he only made the previous call due to the tiny min raise sizing. So the turn comes and it pairs the 4 again. I would check the action back over to my opponent, same as I just did with this hand. Keep in mind I am only committed $75 to the flop action, plus an additional $15 pre-flop. So now when the turn breaks out, my opponent should switch gears. Certainly he's no good with ace high. So instead of going for a value bet sizing if he had actually hit the flush, he should smash the sphincter out of the pot with an overbet shove. I'd be looking at over a $400 bet, which with my less than $100 invested, I would just fold and let him take it down. The hands that I'd be beating would be very specific. It'd be exactly a flush draw. My opponent should never have a 4 here for trips, considering his substantial raise on the flop. But I still lose to a multitude of better jacks as well as bottom boat. It wouldn't be worth it for me to continue. I could just find a better spot. So that's how my opponent should have played this hand if he chose the path of violence. And it would have worked. Even if I did decide to call his overbet shove, and it's a massive if, he still have a good 12 outs to improve. 9 for the flush and 3 for the ace. So if my opponent wanted to play his hand aggressively to maximize fold equity, that's one way how he could have done it. About 30 minutes later, we're currently 6-handed for this one. Under the gun limps. I decide to limp with this complete garbage here, aka Queen 3 of hearts. So I do not advise playing cards like these. I always caution my coaching students to play a much better hand range. It's like if I were to teach you martial arts, I would start with some basic punches and blocks. I'm not going to start with trying to teach you a spinning back kick. Even I myself rarely play steaming garbage like this, but I do play them now and again to throw my opponents off and make them think I'm much looser than I actually am. So this hand starts off with my warning label that you're better off just avoiding these sorts of hands. But here I do limp in the middle position. The button limps, the small blind completes, and the big blind checks. So we go 5-handed to a flop of King 5-7 with 2 hearts and a club. Oh wow, we actually flopped a flush draw. The first 3 players check to me. I throw out a tiny little $10 pot sweetener, betting on the come as the cool kids like to say. Everyone folds, but the under the gun limper calls. The turn is a 4 of diamonds. 6-8 makes the nuts. My opponent checks again. Well, we don't have 6-8, but we did gain a gut shot to go along with our flush draw. A 6 on the river would give us the dummy end of the straight. Our opponent hasn't shown any strength, so let's see if he's willing to continue for a full pot-sized bet. I shoot out a bet of $45. Again, our opponent makes the call. The river comes, and wouldn't you know it, it's a deuce of diamonds, doing absolutely nothing for us. This is, however, to be expected. You gotta remember we only started the hand with a 38% chance to win against a naked king with no hearts. More often than not, we're gonna miss, just like how our opponent missed his draw with the ace-8 of hearts in the last hand. Sure, you can just rely on those odds, or you can improve them further using fold equity and bluffs. We've arrived at the river, so fold equity is no longer a thing. We attempted that on the flop and turn, but our opponent held on tight. So now, to win this hand, we're only left with the option to bluff. If I throw out another pot-sized bet, like 100 for instance, or something similar, I don't think I can get even King Rag to fold here. I mean, would you fold if you were holding a hand like King 9 or King 10? Because I know I wouldn't. So instead, I choose a non-standard size. I shoot out a toe-curling bet of $225 into the $135 pot. Our opponent thinks about this for only a few short seconds before making the fold. We get this one through. Okay, so before this hand starts, I've been playing on my previous short-handed table for over 2 grueling hours. 2 hours with pots barely over $100 and only 2 hands recorded. I was actually up over $600 in that time, but it was through a bunch of tiny pots. We're talking like flopping a set and winning $30. I was considering taking off, but then the table finally broke, so I got moved to this new full-handed table. People are hooting and hollering on this table, so I get the impression it's an action table. Here, under the gun and the cutoff limps. I limp on the button with Jack Deuce of clubs, because as you guys know, I expand my range almost infinitely on the button. Again, don't try this at home, folks. This is like that spinning back kick we mentioned earlier. The small blind completes, but then the big blind throws out an incredibly annoying raise to 25. Under the gun and the cutoff both call. Okay, so this is a really annoying raise. Due to the number of limpers and his weak position, any real hand should have smashed this with like a $40 or $45 raise. This $25 raise is just a pot sweetener. I considered 3-betting just out of annoyance, but my line wouldn't exactly make any sense. There's less than a 1% chance I would have limped here on the button with an actual monster. But I do feel obligated to call since I am still on the button, and I'm deep enough that if I hit a miracle, I could potentially get paid off enough to substantiate the call. So that's what I do. The small blind folds, however, so we go 4 ways in position to a flop of 9-9 queen with 1 spade and 2 clubs. Woohoo! We managed to flop a flush draw in position yet again. And again, same as before, the action checks around to us. Not one to miss an opportunity to utilize that juicy fold equity, I start with a third pot bet of 35. If I just had a queen here, this is likely the same price point I would use. If someone got sneaky and checked with a 9 here, we're about to find out real quick. So for 35, the big blind calls, but the other 2 players fold. Good, I can work with that. So the turn comes, and it's a 4 of spades, putting 2 spades on board. This doesn't help us whatsoever. For some reason, our opponent thinks this 4 is good enough to lead, with a bet of 20. This is kind of a laughable bet sizing. Could he be trapping here? If I just call, my hand is pretty face up. I think if our opponent had a 9, he would have already check raised us since the bet I threw out was so laughably small, and the board is pretty dynamic after all. If he had a queen, I think he would have just led on the flop with a bet of his own. I don't see how this 4 helps unless he's holding pocket 4s, or if he has a hand like 10-8 of spades, maybe? $20 is just a really good price for our draw, even if it is admittedly on a paired board, but I think I'm gonna go with a different route. I think a $20 bet is just a nonsensical bet, like a blocker bet of some sort to assess the strength of our hand. I really like playing draws in position aggressively, so I'm gonna rep that 9. I raised the action up to 145, which would be how much I would raise if I actually did have a 9. Our opponent thinks his options over for a moment. If he raises us here, it's just going to be an unfortunate snap fold. We could be drawing dead. Instead, he eventually counts out calling chips and throws them into the middle for a call. So we go to a river, and it's the 6 of spades. Again, for the 3rd time in a row, a flush draw has bricked out. Nothing surprising here. The river did complete the backdoor flush draw though. As if on cue, our opponent takes a non-standard approach and leads once again, but to the tune of 255 this time, which is barely a half-pot bet. Unless he's sitting here with quads, I think any real hand here would go for a check raise, considering how aggressive I've been so far. So the fact that he led both on the turn and on the river leads me to believe he's not actually all that strong. Maybe he has a hand like a weak-suited queen or something. He doesn't want to face a full pot-sized bet for me if he checks, and he's hoping I just give up if I miss my draw. Well, I mean, he's kind of not wrong. We did miss our draw, but unfortunately for him, I can see past his tactics. Yes, I have Jack freaking high. What's worse, I can't even beat Jack 10, which would be a missed straight draw. But the way I've played the hand so far, I've been repping an extremely strong hand, so I'm going to continue doing that. I could have a hand like Queen 9 suited, or 6-9 suited for instance, both of which would have played how I've played the hand so far. This includes betting on the flop, even with the flop boat, because in a deep stack game, you need to build your own pots. I've already set up the flop bet and the turn raise to sell this story, so let's sell it. I raise my opponent's bet to a terrifying $850. My opponent goes into the tank for over a minute. Unfortunately for us, I accidentally turned off my camera when I raised my phone to capture the board and bets. But thankfully though, our opponent does eventually make the fold. We get another massive bluff through after missing our draw. 15 minutes later, the hijack limps. I open to 20 in the cutoff with ace-10 of diamonds. The button, small blind, big blind, and hijack all call. So we go 5 ways to flop of 7, jack, queen, with 2 hearts and a spade. We flop a gut shot with the ace as an overcard. The action checks around to us. I don't want to bloat this pot up multi-way with such a weak draw, especially when there's 2 hearts on board, so I just check the action back, and the button checks as well. This is called realizing our equity. If I were to c-bet here and someone check raises, I'm just going to be forced to fold, and we actually have some decent outs to improve. If I had ace-10 of hearts, on the other hand, I would definitely c-bet here. So we go to a turn, and it's a 5 of clubs, not changing a whole lot. The action checks around to the hijack, who throws out a $40 bet. We have 3 outs to make the nuts, and an additional 2 outs to hit an ace that's not a heart. So I think $40 is a reasonable enough price for us to call. So that's what I do, and everyone else folds. The river is the perfect bink card. It's a king of diamonds, giving us the absolute nuts. It's hard to get paid off on a king though if our opponent just has a hand like a jack or a queen. But then suddenly, our opponent goes from a tiny 40% pot bet to smashing the crap out of this river with a $165 bet into the pot of 180. Holy smokes! I'm salivating. I contemplate how much to raise to. With a bet that strong, our opponent is repping either a massive hand or a complete bluff. We're really hoping it's the former, and he's holding a hand like 9-10 for the open-ender that river to straight. If he just has a naked jack or queen here, he's not paying us even if we just min-raise him, so we can forget about targeting those sorts of hands. I'm really hoping he does have a hand like 9-10, or even king jack or king queen for 2 pairs. We would never try to bluff this river versus a pot-sized bet, but that $165 bet is very polarizing. Our opponent is saying he either has the goods or nothing at all. So after a little bit of contemplation, I shoot out a raise to 700. We're battling a fellow professional named Jordan, whose giant football ring you guys may have seen resting on the table in previous vlogs. Unfortunately for us, Jordan makes almost an immediate fold, so I guess he had nothing after all. A few minutes later, the cutoff limps. I raise the action up to 20 on the button with ace-jack offsuit. The big blind and cutoff both call, so we go 3 ways in position to flop of 6-jack-6, rainbow. We flop top pair with top kicker on an extremely polarizing board. The action checks around to us. On a board this polarizing, without any straight or flush draws of any kind, someone is likely drawing extremely thin. We're talking like 2 outs. So on such a board, I c-bet for a very small amount of 25. The big blind calls, but the cutoff folds. The turn is a queen of hearts. The big blind, our friend whom we bluffed earlier with the jack deuce of clubs, suddenly comes out betting for 20. This is similar to what he did earlier, but unlike before, this board is not nearly as dynamic. I can see how a 6 would take this line. I can't even beat a queen though, so no point raising here, so I just make the call. The river is an ace of diamonds. We improve. We're now beating jack queen, or some other strange naked queen like queen 10 or something. Our opponent continues with another bet of 50. He's saying he doesn't care about that queen, or the ace for that matter. So against these sorts of bets, I don't think he has a jack here. He could have a queen, he could have a 6. I think there are just way too many landmines on this board to go for thin value. So instead of raising, I just make the call. Our opponent flips over king 6 offsuit for flop trips. I don't know why he would play king 6 offsuit in bad position versus a $20 raise, but we can't control what other people do. We can only control our own actions, and I'm glad that I played this hand with major restraint. I think we lost the minimum here. Alright, time for a brief intermission. Everyone I run to in person absolutely loves my vlogs, but we're still such a small, barely profitable channel. My wife and I work tirelessly on this channel in hopes of growing it to a respectable level someday. To that end, we could really use your help. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for more coaching videos, come support us on Patreon. For a small monthly fee, you can check out all of my coaching videos I've made so far. Speaking of increasing our subscriber base, as you know, this is an educational channel. However, I'm thinking about deviating for a small series and hopefully bring in some new subscribers. What do you guys think about this? I want to run a 24-hour poker marathon challenge. As you know, I typically only play about 3 to 4 hour sessions, but maybe if I make a fool of myself and run a stupid challenge, people might want to watch. I know Gazzy B has already completed a similar challenge, but he's a young man compared to me, and I'm going to give myself a few handicaps. For starters, I'm going to limit myself to 2 buy-ins. Well, maybe 2 and some change, since I typically bring slightly over 2 buy-ins with me every night. So maybe like a stop loss of 3,500. I want to try to complete this 24-hour marathon session without going over that buy-in limit, because without the stop loss, especially with my gambling addiction, I might just blow away my entire savings otherwise. Okay, so I have to try to play 24 hours straight. We're going to stick to 2-5, assuming 2-5 runs all through the night. Okay, so you guys don't know this about me, but I make it a point to never eat or drink anything while I play poker. So this means nothing to eat or drink during the entire 24-hour duration, provided I even last that long. Not even water. My prediction is I'm going to start off super strong in the first 4 hours because that's my usual brain retention capacity. After that, I'm probably just going to spew like crazy. I think I'll dust off my 2 buy-ins after like hour 10 or something similar. I don't actually think I'm going to complete this challenge, but it might be fun for you, the viewer. The last time I played anywhere close to this was well over 15 years ago, back when I was in my late 20s. If I get anywhere close to completion, this is going to be a multi-part series, since my typical vlogs only cover a 4-hour poker session. How do you guys think I'll do? Let me know in the comments below. Alright, now let's get back to the action. 30 minutes after our last hand, there's a live 10. The hijack limps. I limp in the cutoff with Queen 9 of hearts. The button raises to 50 with a stack of about 950. The small blind calls, but the big blind, straddle, and hijack all fold. I'm not loving this spot being trapped in the middle. In hindsight, I think I should have just folded here. Whenever I play a weak hand like this, I like having position, which I'm not going to have here unless I somehow kick out the button post-flop. But here, I do make the call. So the flop comes, and it's a pretty good one. It's 9-4-2 with 1 club and 2 spades. We flop top pair. Suddenly, the small blind comes out betting for 50. He plays very non-standard, so it's difficult to adequately gauge his hand strength. Before this hand, I saw him cold call a $150 3-bet with 3-4 of diamonds in the small blind, which is absolutely bonkers. I mean, the original raiser could have 4-bet, so he might never have even seen a flop. I guess he's what you might call an action player. I can't let this flop go for only $50, so I bump the action up to 150, which is still only a pot-sized bet. If the button cold calls me, or worse yet, raises, I'll know I'm no good for sure. Thankfully, that doesn't happen. The button folds, but the small blind makes the call. The turn is an ace of hearts. 3-5 makes the nuts, and the ace-high flush draw has us completely crushed as well. Suddenly, the small blind comes out betting yet again, but for a measly $100 into the pot of $475. This is the 3rd time he's played this very unusual fashion against us. The first time, we bluffed him on the river. The second time, he actually had the goods with flop trip 6s. I don't know what to make of these small bets, but against this particular opponent, I don't think I can fold. I just clench my butt cheeks and make the call. The river is an inconsequential 6 of diamonds. 3-5 is still the nuts. Small blind comes out betting yet again, but to a much more substantial near half pot size of 300. I don't think we're good here, but for this bet size, with relevance to the pot, we only have to be right 1 in 4 times to be profitable here. So I make the crying call, and our opponent flips over ace-4 offsuit for the turn 2 pairs. We lose this pretty substantial pot, diminishing our profits for the day. The very next hand, I open to 35 in the low jack with ace-king of spades. The cutoff and button both call, so we go 3 ways out of position to flop of ace-3-5 with 1 club and 2 spades. That's a pretty darn good flop if I do say so myself. We flop top pair, top kicker with the nut flush draw. I start with a roughly half pot bet of 50 into the pot of 110. The cutoff folds, but the button raises me to 150 with the $500 stack. Ideally, he has a hand like ace-jack or ace-queen, and he's drawing extremely thin. Or better yet, he has a smaller flush draw, and he's drawing very close to dead. He could have 2 pairs with a hand like ace-3 or ace-5 suited, but for his small stack size, I think our hands are pretty much tied here. I could try to be a bit more cautious if our opponent were deeper, but against a stack of only 500, I'm just going to get it all in every time here. So I go all in and our opponent snap calls, flipping over pocket 3s for a set of 3s. Don't pay any attention to the people making change in the middle of the hand. Anyways, our opponent boats up with an ace of diamonds on the turn, and to add insult to injury, the river is a 4 of spades, which improves us to the nut flush. We lose 2 big hands back to back, bringing us back down from our lofty heights to hovering near even for the day. About 10 minutes later, the middle position opens to 20. The hijack calls. Since I have position to the original raiser, I call with king 5 of hearts in the cutoff. Again, I must reiterate that I don't advise playing these sorts of garbage hands. Keep them out of your repertoire completely. It's like if I try to teach my daughter how to ride a bicycle, I don't want her copying me when she sees me popping wheelies and riding without hands. Save the fancy stuff for later. I'll walk you through how I play such hands to be profitable, but I do not advise playing them to begin with, because more often than not, you're just going to get yourself in trouble. But here I do make the call, and both the blinds call as well. We go 5 ways in position to flop a 5-10 jack rainbow with 1 heart. We flop bottom pair with a few different backdoor draws. Small blind leads for 40 into the $100 pot. He's our nemesis from the many previous hands of this session. Big blind folds. The middle position calls and the hijack folds. Since we do have that backdoor flush draw, I make the call. The turn is a 3 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. The action checks around to us. So far, no one's shown any real strength, so maybe I can take the pot down right here and now. This is the power of position, and the reason why I'm likely to play stupid hands as long as I have position. I throw out a terrifying pot-sized bet of 200, and all I have is freaking bottom pair. Small blind, our nemesis, makes the call, but the middle position folds. The river is a king of diamonds. We improve, but the backdoor flush draw gets there as well. Queen 9 also makes a straight. Suddenly, small blind comes out leading for 300. We just improved to 2 pairs. This is true, but think about this logically. What hands do we actually beat where an opponent comes out betting this strong? Every other combination of 2 pairs that hits the king will have us beat. Hands like King 10 and King Jack, for instance. Queen 9 makes a straight. We also lose to the backdoor flush. In fact, the only hands we're beating are hands like King 9 and King Queen, but that's it. We're not beating any other value hands. We basically have a bluff catcher. So even though this river card highly improves our hand strength, you're probably really itching to raise here. But if you think about it rationally, we really only do have a bluff catcher. So I make the rational decision and just call. Our opponent flips over 4-7 off suit. 4 freaking 7 off suit. He led the flop with complete air, then called a massive pot-sized bet on the turn with a naked gut shot draw on a board with 2 diamonds. That's the sort of crazy we're dealing with. So maybe now you can understand why I called him with Queen 9 of hearts in my hand earlier. Speaking of which, at least we make up for the losses from that hand. 30 minutes after our last hand, we've lost a player, so now we're down to 7-handed. Here, under the gun opens to 25. The cutoff calls. I consider raising on the button with my pocket 9s, but 9s can't withstand most flops, but it plays really well multi-way if I flop a set, so I decide to just flat call. And of course, a friend in the big blind calls as well. The flop comes, and it's 5-4-3 with 2 spades and a heart. Everyone checks it over to me. Excellent. This is a pretty darn good flop for pocket 9s. Now I wish I really had 3-bet after all, but hindsight is always 20/20. So here I throw out a full pot-sized bet of 100. Big blind suddenly check raises me to 200. Under the gun folds, but to make matters worse, Jordan cold calls the 200 in the cutoff with me still yet to act to complete the action. That's terrifying. I mean, what if I just put in another raise here? I can't see him throwing away $200 unless he has a really good hand. It's only 100 more for me to call. Normally, I would just fold here. I could very easily be drawing close to dead if someone flopped a straight. And Jordan, who just cold called even with me as the original bettor yet to act against the raise, could plausibly have flopped a set here. I'm actually more afraid of the cold call than the check raise. The check raise is coming from our friend, Mr. 4-7 offsuit, whom we've been battling for the past few hours. He could have anything here, from an open-ended draw, the spade flush draw, to gosh knows what. I don't want to get myself dizzy pondering over what El Pollo Loco could min-raise with. I heavily consider folding here, but since it's only 100 more to me, and I do have position, let's see what happens on the turn. I make the call. The turn is pretty damn freaking ugly. It's a 6 of hearts. A deuce or 7 makes a straight, and every rational 2-pair combination gets there as well. Big blind suddenly comes out firing for 275, which is actually a pretty weak bet given the pot size. Jordan tanks. What I do is heavily reliant upon what he does. But after a full minute, he folds! Oh, phew! He was the one I was actually worried about. Alright, now we gotta figure out what to do against our friend, the action player here. If he has a straight, I'm drawing completely dead. If he has 2 pairs, I'm drawing incredibly bad, and I don't know what card on the river will be safe for me. So it's time to go on a fishing expedition. Here, listen to how I try to gain some much needed information. You want to check the river if I call? I have a really bad hand. You check the river if I call?
Well, check the river.
Yeah, like I'm just gonna put in the 275 and that's it. No more betting. You're not gonna do that. I mean, you get another 275. My hands are really bad.
How about we bet the river right now?
The river on the turn. The river turn bet.
Make it.
I don't even want to call this.
Make it 600 right now.
How about I just, like let my hand go? You don't even get this. That's pretty much it. Oh man, sorry. Alright, so I asked my opponent if he's willing to check the river if I make this call. If he answers yes to this question, I'm just gonna fold. It will mean he wants the call. I tell him I have an extremely bad hand, which is true given the board dynamic. If he has a set, a straight, or two pairs, I'm drawing extremely close to dead. To have a straight here though, he would need to have a hand like 5-7, or flop the nut straight with 6-7. For him to have a 2 here, he would need to have check raised the flop, holding the bottom end of the straight draw, which seems a bit far-fetched, unless he already flopped the straight with a hand like ace-deuce. But to answer my question, my opponent says, how about we just throw in a bunch of money right now before we even get to the river? Now, why would I want to do that if I barely want to make this call as it is? This is an extreme show of bravado. I've come to the conclusion that my opponent doesn't actually have anything yet, so I make the call. When someone asks you questions during the middle of a hand, they're fishing for information. It's best not to say anything at all. So the river comes, and it's the deuce of hearts, which I'm a huge fan of. Unless we were already drawing dead to begin with, and our opponent is holding a 7, this deuce should have saved our butts in the case our opponent actually had 2 pairs or a set, or something similar, and our read was wrong. To make matters even better, our opponent throws out an incredibly weak bet of 300 into the pot of 1250. That is one of the weakest, I hope we're chopping, bets I've ever seen. He has 1400 behind his bet, and my stack is about the same. So I snap shove all in, even though my hand's been counterfeited, and I'm literally playing the board. If the river had been a random jack, or some other high card, I was fully prepared to snap call any bet our opponent makes, but this deuce is so much better. It ensures we can only chop or win. There is no losing here. This is pretty much a risk-free maneuver on my part, given that I highly doubt our opponent is carrying a 7. I mean, I did evade the snap call, which is perfect. Our opponent goes deep into the tank, counting his remaining chips. He knows he's in a chop or lose situation, and he has nearly 1400 behind, which is pretty significant. That's a lot of beans. He can still make a comeback with that many beans. Nearly 3 minutes passes before he eventually comes to the wise decision and folds. Well, I say it's wise because any decision that fattens our pockets is a wise decision from where I'm standing. For the last hand of the night, the middle position opens to 20. The low jack and high jack both call. By now, you should know that I play with all sorts of junk as long as I have position, so I make the call with 8-10 offsuit in the cutoff. The button folds, but the small blind makes a nonsense raise to 50 with a $3,500 stack. He's since recovered in the last 30 minutes and gone on a massive heater. His chips have been rising and falling with the tide over the last several hours. Easy come, easy go when you play as loose as he does, I guess. So for his tiny raise, everyone already in the pot calls, so I'm forced to call as well. So we go 5 ways in position in an incredibly bloated pot to a flop of 9-6-2 rainbow. Everyone checks to me. This is perfect. This is actually a really good flop for our hand. Everyone is likely sitting there with random overcards. We flop a gut shot to the nuts, as well as an overcard to the 9. Position is the one and only reason I play these types of hands in raised pots. I would advise against limping with a hand like this or even playing it to a raise in early position. But here, since I'm last to act and everyone has already checked to me, I start with a reasonable bet of 150. This should get all random overcards to fold. And surely enough, everyone does. So we take this one down without a fight. After this hand, the action player leaves, so we rack up our chips and do the same. In for 1500 and out for 3143 for a delectable profit of $1,643 after just under 5 hours of playtime. Today's session covered the awesome power of position and how much more value you gain with garbage hands as long as you have position. Again, most of the moves we discussed in today's video were pretty advanced, so I do not advise trying to mimic them in live poker, especially if you're playing 1-3 or a typical 100 big blind structure. Save the advanced moves for when you're actually ready for them, young grasshopper. If you like what you saw today, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. Keep an eye out for my 24-hour marathon challenge. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.